Today, a big portion of my presentation, based on the title, is about equity. And so I really want to acknowledge up front, right? I am a white woman. I was born in the United States, and that has given me certain privileges that I've had from the day that I was born. And in the equity work that I've been doing, I have learned that it is important to acknowledge that up front and to own that and have an understanding of what that means. So I just want to share that from the beginning, and that in my presentation, that's the lens through which I'm speaking, and want to just own that and be clear about that. I also want to acknowledge from the beginning that I have a colleague at the city. Her name is Stacy Stout, and she heads up our equity and engagement office. She is an instrumental partner of mine and colleague. We work very closely together. I'm extremely grateful for her partnership. Some of the slides that I will be presenting today are attributed to her and her work, so I really want to acknowledge and lift her up as one of my colleagues at the city. I did share a copy of my slides, so I will probably go a little fast through the slides, just knowing me and wanting to be respectful of our time, but wanted to let everybody know that I've shared a copy of the slides that will be made available, or you can reach out to me and I'd be happy to share them with you. With that, I'm going to focus on sustainability and equity in 2020 and beyond, and really doing that through the lens of our city's strategic plan. And so with that, just quickly, the items to review. Of course, I want to really spend some time, since many of the students here today are interested in planning, to really dive into how we developed our strategic plan and how we're working to implement it. And throughout the entire presentation, I'll be weaving through components of equity and sustainability, as those are critical components of our plan, as well as trying to lift up some examples of that specific work. And then toward the end, I'm going to wrap up by talking about transitioning to environmental and climate justice, which is the work. I wear two hats. I was originally hired as the sustainability manager and was very focused on environmental sustainability. But then I was asked to create our Office of Performance Management, which is around implementing our strategic plan. So this last part, though, for me is really talking about how I'm working to bring together the environmental work that I've been doing and the equity work, and the kind of the marriage between those two and the intersection being now what is kind of environmental or climate justice. So you can find a copy of our strategic plan online. I encourage you to go to this website. It includes all of our performance management documents and reports that we have done. The plan was approved by our city manager by our city commission in April of 2019. So we're about a year and a half into the plan. It's a 4-year plan. And I really want to speak to the fact that you'll see here the cover in Spanish. And as I continue to talk about and lift up equity, language access is extremely important to our community, and working to ensure that information is accessible to people throughout our community. So working hard for Spanish interpretation and language access across a number of different areas within the city. On the contents, I know it's a little small here, but I do want to highlight a few things. In particular, we start with our manager's letter. For those maybe that are not familiar with the City of Grand Rapids government operations, we're what's called a council manager form of government. So we have 6 commissioners and the mayor are all elected, and those are our policy leaders. So they develop policy for the city, but they appoint a city manager who serves as the CEO of city operations. And so City Manager Mark Washington joined the City of Grand Rapids in the fall of 2018. He came from Austin, Texas. And it was really his vision that he brought with him from his experience in Austin to have Grand Rapids create a strategic plan and have that drive our performance. And so it's been really important for us, and I think in many cases, that this be led from your top leadership within your organization. Going to talk a little bit about the planning process and elements, focus a little on our values. That's very important, leads a lot of our work, and then just share a little bit about some priorities and implementation. So jumping right in and talking about, well, how did this plan come to fruition? I mentioned when City Manager Washington joined, he said, I want to develop a strategic plan. And at the time I was doing sustainability work, and he came to me and said, Allison, will you lead the creation of a strategic plan with a very cross-functional team of staff? And so he wanted it done within about 5 months, which is an extremely short time frame to do a comprehensive strategic plan for your city. But he knew and wanted to ensure that our strategic plan drives our fiscal plan or our budget. And that budget was to be presented in April, and he wanted the strategic plan completed in time so that the budget could be presented in alignment with the strategic plan. And so we started around November, and just a few things process-wise, but there was an 8-person executive team led by the city manager to ensure that executives were all integrated into the process. I was serving as the project manager, and we developed kind of a team that was called the project team, and that's 10 of us, and we were really kind of the staff that I refer to as the workhorses, really working on developing the content and being the conduit from a larger group of staff of about 35 that were helping, and then being the conduit to the executive leadership team. So the city manager worked really hard to engage over 1,000 employees to get some feedback on our values. And then when we had the draft plans done, we actually had 4 workshops that we hosted with our city commission to have them be a part of the development of the process from the leadership down and really help establish the vision for where we're going. And we also hosted a digital town hall. So the triangle you see on the left side is really what we consider our framework. And first, I want to point you to the triangle on the top left, that's the upside down triangle. So we have a master plan for the city. It's a comprehensive plan about, where do we want and how do we want our community to develop. It's a 20-year plan. We're actually getting ready to start on creating our new master plan in the next year. But that's really the long-term plan for the community. And then we had our fiscal plan, which we do every year as an annual plan, and of course drives investment. And so the strategic plan is intended to be the plan between those two. And how does it drive the fiscal plan, but how does it line up with and help support the master plan? And so you can see along the left side of the larger triangle, there are a few things here that I think are important. At the top, we talk about this as aspirational, the middle is achievable, and then the bottom are specific and tangible. And how do you establish a framework for creating a plan so that you can implement it? And so our values are really, what do we stand for? How do we make decisions? You make them based on your values. Your vision is, where do we want to go in the future? What is it that we want to be? So it's very forward looking. And then your mission is, what do we do on a day-to-day basis as an organization? And then I'm going to share a little bit about, the priorities are really kind of our high-level buckets, how we organize the plan. We have 6. And outcomes are really important. That's what we want to achieve in each of those different priorities. And I won't get into the more granular details around objectives and strategies and metrics. I just encourage you to check out the plan and see how all of those work together. So we spent quite a bit of time in the beginning with our city commission and establishing our values. And actually, up front, we looked at GVSU's strategic plan and had a couple folks from GVSU come speak to us about the creation of your plan. And it's common to have values. And so we had not established values across our city organization before. So we created these 6: accountability, collaboration, customer service, equity, innovation, and sustainability. And so we're going to spend some time today talking about equity and sustainability. If you see our vision statement, it says that we want our city, again, this is future looking, to be nationally recognized as an equitable, welcoming, innovative, and collaborative city with a robust economy, safe and healthy community, and the opportunity for a high quality of life for all. And our mission is to elevate the quality of life through excellent city services. And then finally, for kind of just orientation of our plan, as I mentioned, we have 6 priorities. So we have governmental excellence, we have economic prosperity and affordability, engaged and connected community, health and environment, mobility, and safe community. Equity as a value and sustainability as a value are woven throughout the entire plan, as is all of our values. But I will spend a little bit of time on governmental excellence, where we lift up embedding equity as well as health and environment to talk about some environmental sustainability work. And so just want to share that, again, we were very intentional about equity. We have an entire page up front in our plan that is our equity statement. And here, again, this is from my colleague, Ms. Stout, but just to frame, because I think there's sometimes a lot of confusion about equity. But so what is equity? And equity is a condition that's achieved when people have the tools, resources, and connections necessary to be fully engaged and prepared to benefit from the opportunities they seek. And racial equity is achieved when one's race or ethnicity does not determine in a statistical sense how one experiences opportunity, power, and life outcomes. And so this is online, and I'll refer to our demographic statement later, but we really talk about how as a city, we are dedicated to equity and we are leading with racial equity specifically. And that often is a question. There are a lot of different types of inequities, of course, out there. You can talk about gender, you can talk about age, you could talk about differing abilities, a multitude of different types and information and segments when you discuss equity. But we are very specific at the city that we lead with racial equity. And that's because a lot of research has been done that shows that if you focus on racial equity, all of the other segments of society that have been marginalized will also benefit. And so in the short term, that is really our key area of focus that we have. And it's about, how are we providing services as a city government, but also looking at how do we design policy and how do we implement policy to help work for those that are positioned farthest away from access and opportunity due to the centuries and the current realities of structural racism. And that's important. There's historic racism that's existed for a long time that has, dictated where we are today, but it still exists in many forms in institutional, structural, and systemic racism. And so acknowledging that those exist today and what are we doing at the city to help dismantle those and to reduce those barriers, right? But talking about how this racism and how these structures disproportionately impact BIPOC communities, which are Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And I really like here that Ms. Stout really talks about, right, through our mission, it's to elevate the quality of life through excellent city services. But we as a city organization cannot be excellent if we are not equitable. So very high level, again, what is equity? Right, we refer to it as a targeted universalism approach that focus on improvements that work for those positioned farthest away from opportunity. It's about policy and practice change. It's very data informed and people driven. And one thing that's really important is it addresses power. Who is at the table? Who gets to make decisions on the policies or the plans that are designed? And that's a very important component. And it's not the same as diversity or inclusion. Diversity is about if you look around the table and you were to say how many people from this race, this ethnicity, or of these different gender identifications, how evenly or how well do they match our community? That's diversity. And inclusion is now if you have a diverse representation on your team, how included do all of those people feel in the conversation and in the power structure and in the decision making? Those are very different in terms of identifying and understanding if the work that you're doing is resulting in equitable outcomes. So now just spending a little bit of time on sustainability. So the way that we define our sustainability value is the ability to be maintained, right? The definition of sustain is to be able to go on indefinitely or for however long you choose. But it's really about how when we make decisions, understanding how those decisions impact not only the environment, but people and communities, as well as finances, not only today, but also in the future. And so to be very clear, environmental sustainability, talking about energy or carbon, water quality, access to green space, right? That's environmental sustainability. And that's one component of sustainability in the triple bottom line. But it's important to recognize the difference between true environmental sustainability work and more holistic sustainability work. Because when I talk about sustainability on its own, it's not something you say, well, what are the sustainable programs you do? And you don't talk about climate change mitigation or adaptation. Sustainability in the way that we use it at the city, it's a decision-making framework. How are you thinking about impacts in these three areas anytime you make a decision? So as I said, governmental excellence is one of our 6 strategic priorities. It's the first one, and we started with this one intentionally to lead with our first objective, which is around equity and embedding equity throughout our government operations. And so here you'll see some of our strategies, right? Talking about creating an infrastructure to help elevate this focus on equity work. I'm going to talk about our commitment to disaggregate all of our data. Talking about the racial equity impacts of major policy proposals and initiatives, applying racial equity to budgetary requests, and then really working on identifying systemic issues that are causing disparate impacts and figuring out ways to address those. So one way that this is done to create that infrastructure is, right, our city manager established an Office of Equity, again, different from diversity and inclusion. Hired a dedicated equity officer that's connected directly to the organization's leader and has access to strategic planning information. And my colleague works collaboratively with all departments across the organization. Equity is a journey. It takes time, right? And another thing that I would say, and one of our big commitments where we're tracking is in-depth equity training for staff or for your clients or your members. I am very fortunate that when I came to the city as a part of our leadership team, I received about 32 hours of equity training, right? You don't sit in one webinar for an hour and learn about equity, right? That's not enough. It's a commitment to really learn about it and to understand it within your organization in a broader context. So I also mentioned health and environment is one of our other strategic priorities. And this is more that environmental sustainability work as well as health. So we talk about reducing carbon emissions, climate resiliency, ensuring access to green spaces, looking at water resources and water quality, talking about minimizing waste generation. And then our last objective is focused on working with partners to help reduce health disparities. Some big cities have their own health departments, but here Kent County has the health department. And so they are the lead with respect to health programs throughout the county. So kind of drilling in a little to lift up some more of the climate specific work in our plan and that my office does. As I mentioned here, the outcome statement in this area is really that the health of all people in the environment are advocated for, protected, and enhanced. And I'm going to come back to this at the end, but I want to point out that you'll notice that the health of people is put before the health of the environment, right? And so under the objective around reducing carbon emissions and climate resilience, we have some things about carbon reduction goals and integrating those into plans like our master plan, reducing the carbon footprint of our own municipal operations. I've been working a lot on renewable energy strategy to get to 100% renewable energy. And hopefully we're going to have a solar project by the end of this year that I'm hoping will go through and be approved. But that number 4 strategy then is really starting to look externally at the community and working to create and support programs and policies that help our community reduce carbon emissions. And that can be from the building or transportation sectors. We're looking, and again, this plan is through 2023. So we're hoping to have a climate action and adaptation plan done at that time. And then also looking and continuing our work around a tree canopy. So that's kind of the framework. I want to spend a little bit of time on plan implementation before I dive a little bit more into some of the remaining components. But right, creating a strategic plan, it was a huge lift. It took a lot of time, and almost for 5-6 months, it became my full-time job. Right? But the creation of the plan is about the first mile of a marathon, right? It seems like an enormous amount of work to get it done, and it is, but you can have the most fantastic plan in the world, and if it sits on a shelf and doesn't achieve anything and is never implemented, well, then all you have is a nice document. So our city manager has been very specific that we will work this plan, we will implement it, and we will live by it. And so one thing he did, in addition to creating the Office of Equity, is he created an Office of Performance Management, which I took that role on in addition to the Office of Sustainability, hired myself to lead that. And again, similar to equity, it has to be connected directly to the organization's leader and have access to strategic planning information. And I work very collaboratively with every department across our entire organization to ensure that the plan's being implemented. But it was something that, I had to think about and work with our leadership and recognize up front. It takes about 3 years to build and implement a performance management program. So it's not something that gets done in a year. We assigned accountability for all of the outcomes in the plan to specific staff. I'm going to share a little bit about some of the systems that we created to measure the quantitative and qualitative performance across our strategic plan. You have to have regular performance management reports out, and you have to be transparent with your leadership as well as with the public so people understand how you're performing. So we provide 2 reports a year, a mid-year report halfway through and an end of the year report. And then another thing that's really important is we are hosting staff leadership retreats where we give staff the opportunity to share their thoughts and their visions and their views, and how is that being incorporated and ensure that they're being engaged in the plan. And so we also, as I mentioned, are working to publish the performance information online and make all of the data publicly available. One thing that's important too is we owned from the beginning, and I looked at a report from, I believe it was Raleigh, North Carolina, and I really appreciated it. We incorporated it. We talked about the plan is a living, breathing document. It will change. It should change. right? Based on what we're learning and what we're understanding. And that doesn't mean 6 months into your plan, do a complete overhaul, but it means be mindful that just because it was completed a year ago doesn't mean that it's perfect and you have to stick exactly to what's in the plan if it's not right. If it's not right, own it, talk about why it needs to be changed, pivot, and move forward. And so we really talk about it being a living, breathing document, even though it's a 4-year plan. We knew going in that this was our first iteration and we were going to be learning a lot from it. As I mentioned earlier, the city manager really reorganized our entire budget process so that it is driven by the strategic plan. It is a performance-based budget. So when he does budget presentations, which I help support, they are all organized based on our 6 strategic priorities and how investments we are making will help achieve the outcomes that we've identified in the plan. We show how we're performing on our metrics and also are working to elevate the work that's aligned to our values. And so the last part, which we're still working on, because again, this is a journey, it takes 3 years. And as I mentioned, we're about 1.5 years in, is how do you integrate your strategic plan performance measures into your employee evaluations? So you're getting all the way down throughout your entire organization. So I'm going to move a little quickly through these slides because again, they're made available, but one of the ways in which we track the quantitative performance, there are 140 metrics in our plan, and that's a lot. That's too many for leadership to digest. So we worked with our data and innovation team to create a key metric dashboard. And I'm going to show you a couple of examples here in just a minute. But one of the commitments we made was that we would disaggregate all of our data by race, ethnicity, gender identity, and geography to the extent possible. And so we have this statement that's available online that you can look at it. Again, we lead with racial equity. And I do, right, there are limitations. Some of the systems where we collect data for hiring purposes combine race and ethnicity. Ideally, you're tracking race wholly and completely separately from ethnicity because they're 2 different demographics. And to truly understand what's happening in your community, you need to track those separately. But sometimes we still have to work on the systems that are in place. Some of them are legally required by the state or the federal government to be collected in a certain manner and submitted. So again, Ms. Stout put together this information. It's available on our demographics page, but this really says our ideal circumstances and scenarios of the data that we would be capturing by race and by ethnicity. And similarly, talking about gender identity and being very cognizant of gender expression, that unfortunately, many times, a lot of systems have been created where they only accept binary responses. You can only indicate female or male. And so we're really working to change those systems and processes where possible to provide the opportunity for people to select non-binary, non-conforming, or prefer not to say. Geography is extremely important, right? This is your world and what you're studying. And I know many of you are interested in GIS. And so we work with my data colleague because in the absence of having race, ethnicity, or gender identity information, if we have geographical information, we have the American Census Survey information that then we overlay in GIS, and we can understand in areas where there are high rates of Black or African Americans living, and it's indicating certain statistical findings and measures that we have, then we can start to disaggregate that data based on the demographics that are important to us. So this is what it looks like, and I'm actually going to go and show an example, but these are more for the slides for after the fact if you're looking at it for the type of information that is made available. But I'm hoping here, if I switch my screen, I'm going to pull this up, and I'm going to look at Jim to wave at me if for some reason you can't see our open performance website page. But I'm just going to quickly show you, because this is a live website, that if you go into our dashboard where we're building out metrics, and it's in phased approaches because of course, my internet's going to run slowly now, but a couple of examples. And so one here, particularly around the demographics. So this is a metric called ALICE, which is asset limited income constrained, and it's but employed. And it's a way to understand people who have employment throughout your community. And so this is showing it's been pretty consistent over time, and we have a lot of information. Where does the data come from? Why does it matter? But this is the part that I wanted to show you in our commitment around equity, right? When you look at it, oftentimes the total number up here is 48% of residents are earning above the ALICE level, and our goal is 55%, right? But when you look at it by race, white residents, 68% are above the ALICE threshold, whereas Asians are 60%, two or more races are 43. And then if you look at Black and African Americans, it's 33%. But if all you do is look at that 48% number, you don't understand the full picture of what's happening in your community and the disparities. And then below we do it by ethnicity, and Hispanic is showing 39%. And then we do it geographically with GIS, where you can drill into certain areas throughout Grand Rapids and understand geographically how people are performing with respect to this particular measure in those areas. So one other one that I will quickly show you is with respect to our own employee turnover rate, right? So staff that leave the city organization for a multitude of different reasons. So if you're looking from an internal perspective to understand this, again, we measure over time, provide a lot of background information, right? But here we're looking at the turnover rate by race, right? And here it says, wow, 58% in this particular year of Asians turned over, of people who are Asian. But if you scroll down here, we had 6 people. So it's important to understand not only the percentage, but to also understand the total count. Because if all we showed was total count, you'd say, wow, you got a lot of white people who are no longer employed at the city organization. Whereas anybody that's of a different race or ethnicity, the numbers look pretty low, so not a big deal, right? But if you look at them, the rate, so the percentage of, for instance, Black or African Americans that turn over as a percent of all Black or African American employees, the numbers tell a very different story. And so we go through, we show our total breakdown, and then we compare it to the American Census data, right? City of Grand Rapids is about 60% white, but our city employees are at 85%, and we're doing a lot to diversify our workforce. But again, this takes time and intentionality, but without that data, then you don't have a clear understanding of what's happening. So these were the 2 examples that I shared, and you have the information in the slides. So I wanted to transition. Another way that we are implementing our plan and measuring how we're performing is more on a qualitative basis, right? If we say that, we want to provide more equity training, we can report out on how many people have received equity training, but there are different ways that you can talk about the different types of equity training that have been offered, how many hours they are, and different information. And so this is a tool that we're using where we're tracking. Here I'm showing governmental excellence and health and environment for the focus today. So on health and environment, right, we can show that 26% of all of our work. So this is a report from our first year under the plan, which is July 1st of 2019 through June 30 of 2020, right? So by and large, 50% was either on track or was completed, and almost 50% was experiencing some type of disruption. So we can understand that. And a lot of that was because of COVID, because when we created our plan for this particular fiscal year, we had no way to anticipate that COVID was going to happen and how that would impact. So kind of transitioning now to dive a little bit more into detail about, well, what is it exactly that we're doing around equity or around environmental sustainability? So again, this is a page out of our recent performance management report that talks specifically about that objective on embed equity. Right. And so talking about how we really worked to apply a racial equity lens for all of the budget process, working with the Equitable Economic Development and Mobility Plan. I'm really talking about MBEs, which are minority business enterprises, and how are we helping to invest in minority-owned businesses. A number of other significant policies. Again, this is that qualitative work where you don't really have a metric that you can measure, but we passed things like a human rights ordinance. We developed new employee resource groups for Black and African Americans, as well as for LGBTQI, talking about the language access and some of those other policies and some of the work that we've done. And the Grand River revitalization work got some fantastic funding of about $800,000 to help ensure that an equity analyst is at the table to help drive and embed equity into that important work. So then switching to kind of health and environment, as I mentioned, this area in the plan is looking at carbon, climate resilience, green space, water, waste diversion, as well as health. So these are just kind of pulling up on how we are demonstrating and being transparent about our performance through those tools that I showed in the health and environment space, right? So green means we've met our goal, blue means that we're measuring it, and red means we haven't achieved that goal yet. So one of the metrics that I kind of own in my office is how much renewable energy are we using? We have a goal to be 100% by 2025, and we're at 37%. So we're not achieving it yet, right? But we still have a couple of years, but we're being transparent about those measures. And some of the specific work that we've been doing in this area of carbon reduction over the last year was we worked really hard at evaluating where we could install solar from a technological standpoint, and then did financial assessment of that on 8 different city properties and modeled how we could possibly meet our 100% renewable energy goal based on some major data tracking that took us a long time to implement. And I want to lift up, he actually is a student, Mike Daisy, who graduated from the GVSU program, was an intern who just did phenomenal work on helping us calculate and measure across 400 different accounts for all of our energy consumption. But now that we're measuring it, we can show that we have a 29% carbon emissions reduction citywide. We launched the community collaboration on climate change, which I could do an entire hour presentation on and would love to. We're doing that in partnership with the community. It's community driven, and that's really looking at an equitable climate change pilot. We also, in partnership with the Urban Core Collective, which is a community-based organization led by people of color and that serves people of color, we launched a resident engagement campaign to really better understand residential needs and obstacles on implementing energy efficiency or decarbonization measures with respect to homes in our community. I have the privilege of being appointed to the governor's first Michigan Advisory Council on Environmental Justice. We work to implement some environmental sustainability requirements in our cannabis licensing ordinance. Cannabis grow facilities are extremely energy intensive, and I worked very closely with our planning department on that. And another one that I worked closely with our planning department was we revised how our ordinances regulate small-scale solar installations on homes or on businesses to streamline that process and make it easier for those in our community that want to install solar. So kind of wrapping up, there are a couple of examples around equity specifically. I won't go through all of these because I've shared some of them already, but a part of our performance management report was really to explain how work that we're doing across the city organization is aligned to and representative of our commitment to equity. All of this work is not done by the Office of Equity, and that's not the intention, right? All of the sustainability work is not done by the Office of Sustainability. These are values that are embedded across our entire organization, and it takes a culture change to be able to do that, and it's not something that just happens overnight. For the city government operations, we're really blessed because environmental sustainability started when Mayor George Hartwell was elected in 2006. And so we fortunately have a long history of environmental sustainability at the organization, and really a focus on equity started when Mayor Bliss was elected in 2016, and she's maintained a commitment to environmental sustainability as well. And so again, the sustainability accomplishments here, you'll see that it's not just about environmental sustainability. It's really talking about the fact that we passed a $530 million budget that was not just based on financial sustainability, it was also based on equity and environmental protection, thinking about those 3 prongs to sustainability, talking about employee wellness programs. Again, they focus on financial, mental, and environmental health, and some of the other different programs that we're working on. So now my last couple of slides that I have are really to talk about, it's referred to in many different ways. It could be environmental justice, environmental equity, or climate justice, climate equity. But some of the things that I want to share is, in this line of work, it's important to recognize and acknowledge the history of the environmental movement, right? It's been driven predominantly by white and affluent people. And that's the context and the lens through which much of the environmental work has been done to date. I think one of the biggest misses so far with climate change work is that in the beginning, we saw all of these images of polar bears on ice caps falling off up in the, in the Arctics and in the poles. And to me, that really missed the key message. And I think, unfortunately, drove a further stake in the divide between the environmental movement being something that has been predominantly led and white people have participated in versus people of color. Right? When you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, The things that are most important and the things that people have to focus on first have to do with food, water, warmth, a place to live, as well as safety and security. And our most vulnerable residents are Black and brown people in our community. And they're often more times than not, are low income or lower income than white counterparts, right? And so at this point in time, they've not had the luxury to think about polar bears on ice caps. Oftentimes, our most vulnerable populations are thinking about and concerned about, how do I keep my house, or how do I make my house payments? My child has asthma and is suffering from a number of different conditions, and now I have to go to the hospital and I have to take off of work. And quite frankly, as you've seen in our community, a lot of concerns around safety and calls for police reform. And so why, if you look around, have people of color not necessarily been at the table? One, I would say it's not been accessible, using a lot of scientific acronym terminology. But two, what's most important to people right now? What are their greatest needs? Right. And I think for me, I'm white, I need to acknowledge and own my privilege that I've had the ability to think about climate change and impacts on polar bears and land use and other issues, because I haven't had to worry about housing or food or safety in my community. And that's something really important to recognize and to understand. I think it's really important to think about many, if not most, human health concerns are caused or exacerbated by environmental pollutants or climate change. And to me, this is the important connection, right? Talking about the pollutants that we have in our environment are causing human health problems. I won't go through all of these. You can look at them at other times, but extreme weather events, when whole populations are displaced and homes are flooded and you have water damage and mold and the more spread of disease, right? Those are human health concerns, and they're driven by climate change. And we need to talk more about human health concerns when we're talking about climate change, to make that connection to those that are most vulnerable in our community. So here are two really good resources that I would encourage you to check out, but really dive into the data and use GIS, the one on the left does, to talk about environmental injustices. Where we have the greatest number of people of color living in our communities, they are also experiencing the highest rates of environmental pollutants, which then lead to the highest rates of health disparities caused by environmental pollutants. And unfortunately, in the top 10 census tracts in Michigan, with the greatest environmental injustices, 5 of them are in Grand Rapids, right? So this is here. It's not somewhere else. This is in Grand Rapids, and we need to acknowledge that and work on it and do better and work in partnership with people to address this. So my last slide that I have, or I think second to last, right, is that for me, the work that I do around environmental justice, it is to fight for a world where the health and prosperity of Black and brown people are fought for, protected, and valued more than that of other species, right? And when I mean other species, I'm talking about polar bears and butterflies and bees and things that I think are very important. And I understand the importance of bees and pollinators and what that does to our food systems and our environment and holistically across the world. But we need to be, I think traditionally a miss has been on the environmental community, has been being too focused on the trees and the bears and not focused on the people in our community who are most in need. And so the last thing here, some things as a takeaway, what can you do? Get educated on the disparate impacts, be knowledgeable about the information and what's happening. Get engaged in some equity trainings, or if you are leading an organization, offer or find funding for equity trainings. Learn about the most important issues for BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and understand how they can compete with and intersect with environmental issues, because there are a lot of, intersections. And I'm low on time, so I'm not going to go into it. But a big assignment I had was to help our police department create their strategic plan. And I thought, my passion in my area is sustainability. Why am I working on a police strategic plan? And had you asked me 8 months ago, I would have said, there's no way I'd ever do that work. But when the city manager asked me to help, I now understood from learning about disparities in equity that this is an issue that is extremely important to our Black and brown community. And if I don't understand what's going on and why it is so important to that community, right, environmental sustainability work or climate change work can be seen as a distraction. And I don't have full awareness of everything that's happening for that particular population that I'm trying to engage in environmental justice work. Lastly, be authentic, be vulnerable. Sometimes I do presentations and I try to say where I have stumbled, where I learned, where I've messed up, because it happens. And it happens a lot in equity, particularly as a white person. And you have to get uncomfortable with conversations to grow and to have meaningful progress. Find people that you trust to have conversations with, and have those hard conversations, because that's when you'll grow. And lastly, be patient and stay committed. The work is emotional and it takes time, but I truly believe that it's absolutely necessary. So in closing, I just want to share, because I really appreciate this proverb, because I've always been a person who's been deadline driven and I have to get this done now. And I try to go as fast as I can, but if you want to go fast, go alone. But really, to do this equitable climate change and equitable environmental work, to go farther, we have to go together. And that means that we need to go slower.